Good day. This is the second in a series on Chautauqua Lake, past, present, and future. We're going to spend most of our time in this segment talking about the geology of the lake so that we can appreciate why it is the way it is and some of the disciplines of the geology that we should respect as we look at the lake today and as we look to the lake's future. We would start out by stretching your imagination, and this is a hard thing to do, to go back 1 million years. And what I'd like you to do is go back 1 million years, and then let's walk to the top of the schoolhouse hill and look around and see what we see before us. As we stand on the top of the schoolhouse hill, it may be anywhere from 50 to 200 feet taller than it is today. John, where do you get that information? Reference for this presentation comes from the Muller and Tesmer New York State Science Museum bulletins that were published in 1963, and from Leslie Crane's The Groundwater Resources of the Jamestown Area, published in 1966, along with a series of studies that were done by students and faculty of the State University College at Fredonia from 1972 through 1978. There are also some historic documents. I may fall back and refer to Obed Edson in some instances, for he has some geological information based on his time and his interpretation. The geology of Chautauqua Lake starts with us standing on top of Schoolhouse Hill. We look to the north and we see woods. We look to the east and we see a valley, a wooded valley possibly. The valley runs northward and it extends down some 17 to 18 miles. There's no Long Point Park Peninsula to disturb your view. You're looking down into the hills that are several feet, more than several feet, 40 to 200 feet, depending upon the interpretation, taller than they are today. You're looking at the valley. As you look at the valley, you find that it's much deeper than it is today. I don't know if any of you have gone out into the area back of Hartfield, into the Hartfield Flats. But there's been some borings done in that area and up toward Brockton, and it is suggested that that valley may have had a depth of as much as 700 feet. As we turn around and look westerly, it may be that there is another valley that comes off and goes off in a westerly direction and through the plateau. Realize that we're standing on the edge of the Allegheny Plateau. We're basically dealing with bedrock of shale. Now I've got to trick you because I put you there 1 million years ago, and now I want you to jumpstart you. I don't know where, but at some point, we're going to look at an ice sheet. And that's all we're going to see. In fact, we may have to be elevated several hundreds, maybe thousands of feet into the air to look at an ice sheet that completely covers the area. And if it's a very, very clear day and the ice sheet has a slope to it, we might note that the tiny southeast corner of the town of Carroll is not covered with any ice. Otherwise, all of Chautauqua County and into Warren County, 6 miles below Frewsburg, we're looking at an ice sheet. How many times this ice sheet moves back and forth, we're not absolutely sure. My information suggests that at least 3, possibly 4 times. The evidence of the ice sheet, I would like to show you on the wall, show you a map from one of the Science Museum bulletins that shows the movement of the ice sheets. And then we'll come back and look at some of the evidence that we can see today if you're willing to get out and walk or row in a boat or walk around the shore of Chautauqua Lake as I have. So I'm going to move up here to the illustration on the wall. And here we have an interpretation of the general flow lines as indicated by the topography that we have in Chautauqua County. And if you can see in enough detail, you can see that the last glacier basically moved across Chautauqua County in this type of direction. In different places it has different cues to it, and if you're interested in this document, there may be several libraries that have it. However, as I have checked the libraries of Chautauqua County, very few of them have Tesmer or Muller's work. It also shows terminal moraines where the ice sheet in its various movements has progressed and then stopped and then retreated. And down here in the corner, you can see that this very small corner of the town of Carroll, you have a moraine that goes down through that area. And if you're interested in the exact location of that moraine, I would suggest that you go to Carroll, go out Oak Hill Road, and where the radio tower is that the Sheriff's Department now has is a county park site. And that hill is part of the terminal moraine. The glaciers did not proceed beyond that point. Other than that, the glaciers moved back and forth. We have a very interesting moraine edge here. This is when we get Long Point State Park. Long Point State Park and Bemis Point are all part of a moraine system. One of the interesting things when we did the geological work and the archaeological work, we found some wonderful things about Bemis Point. Bemis Point is beautiful outwash gravel from one of the last glacier that passed over the area, and it's anywhere from 3 to 4 to 15 feet thick. And after 15 feet, you get into organic silts, and it supports nothing. So you have this wonderful gravel base that is there. And the Indians, I'm getting into another segment there. Bemis Point and Oriental Park are absolutely, or were absolutely loaded with Indian activity, and we'll get into that in another segment. As we look at the lake, I would encourage you to walk around the lake and look at different places so that you can see some of the geological marks. I'd like to take you to the 7.5-minute quadrangle map completed by the U.S. Geological Survey, which by the way is available at our Cooperative Extension Center in Jamestown. And you can buy your own 7.5-minute quadrangle maps. Realize that this composite map is made up of a series of 7.5-minute quadrangles that have been pasted together, and then I've done doodles on them. Lakeview Avenue in Mayview. Look at the uphill side of the ditch, and you'll find that it's shale. Go up Evans or Wayland Street and look at the ditches. They are shale. If you come down to the lakefront in Mayville and walk up the lakefront, you will all of a sudden find, after you've gotten north of the railroad depot and north of Erie Street, that the lake edge is shale. And as you get to Burden Tree Road, you find that you are now in gravels. If you go to the other side of the lake and go down right behind the Marmar restaurant, down into an area called Woodland, and you come up to my wife's grandparents' property, you will find a dynamic change that takes place in the lake shore. Our property has a muck, sand, gravel bottom, and all of a sudden you have shale. And you have shale as the lake edge all the way around to here, and then you find the shale again appearing on this side of the lake. As the glaciers came and went, they lowered the elevation of the topography. Not only did they lower the elevation of the topography, they also carried with them a lot of material from Canada. And I think the best example of some of the material that they carried from Canada can be found in the bottom of Chautauqua Gorge. If you're willing to scramble down at the end of Lyons Road and walk north a little bit, there's a boulder about this big made out of Canadian Shield granite. And throughout the county you find these boulders deposited. As the glacier left, it gave us this terminal moraine feature here. It scoured parts of the lake shore, it lowered the elevation, and through the history of the movement of the glaciers, the valleys began to fill in. And as the valleys filled in, the first thing that we noticed is that there was a terminal moraine in the Jamestown area. And if you want a feeling of what a terminal moraine looks like, I would strongly encourage you on a beautiful fall day to drive through the Lakeview Cemetery in Jamestown. It not only is a peaceful and wonderful experience, but it gives you an idea of the rolling and the tumbling of a terminal moraine. The rest of Jamestown has been leveled out tremendously as compared to what it was when the first European man arrived on the scene. In fact, if you want to have fun, read Hazeltine's early history of the town of Ellicott and realize some of the things that went on, and I'll refer to those in later segments. Have you ever heard of caging? Keep caging in your mind, because that's what they used to do with drunks in Jamestown. And we'll talk about caging in the 1800s. They had a real unique penalty for people that were not sober in public. When we deal with the geology, we've got to understand that this was possibly the through valley route. I can remember in the early 1960s, when there was still a railroad running through Mayville, going out in the fall of the year to pick up some horndice to do some live bait fishing for muskellunge on the lake. And as this railroad train went rumbling through here, I'm out approximately here at the end of this little road, and I'm on a bowl full of jelly. It's just moving like this. And the reason for it, we'll look at the geological history. What we have as those glaciers came and went was a deposition of material in several different layers. As an example, if you have a cottage at the outlet of the big inlet, there is no public water system there, but if you're willing to drill down to somewhere between 132 and 135 feet, voila! There's all the water you want in an area about this big. And a number of people have gotten to that outwash of gravel, and they're getting their water supply from it. Evidence of what happened in the process of glaciation, the receding and the advancement of the various ice sheets. We have a series of things, of course, that we can talk about. Many of you may have remembered the tragedy at the construction of the South Chautauqua Lake sewage plant. A man lost his life because they were using steel beams to support the construction of the plant. They originally did their interpretive work, and they decided that bedrock was at 65 feet on the west side of the site. And based on preliminary drilling on the other portions of the site, they came to the conclusion that, well, we've gone this far and it's the same as this, therefore bedrock is at 65 feet. Well, it turned out that bedrock is not at 65 feet on the eastern edge of the site. They couldn't use pine poles to support the plant. They had to manufacture steel I-beams that went down, I believe, somewhere between about 160 feet to bedrock. So in several hundred feet, you had that type of a drop. So that's evidence of what that valley may have looked like before glaciation. We have other evidence in various parts of the watershed. Realize that as we put sewers, and this takes us up after World War II, but as we put sewers around various parts of the lake, we had to do a series of soil investigations to decide whether or not we could build a system, and if we were to build a system, what type of system we would build. And it very much tells us about the movement of the glaciers in and out and the history of the lake. The first reference that I read to a history of the elevation of the lake is in Obed Edson's piece of work, and I'm at this moment don't remember which reference that's in, because not only does Obed do a piece, but he also participates in several other historic documents. He suggests, based on his examination and another gentleman writing his master's thesis for Cornell, that maybe in parts of the Chautauqua Lake watershed at some point the lake elevation was 50 feet above what you and I know today. The other work by Crane, Tesmer, and Muller refer to elevations of 20 and 30 feet above what it is today. Some of the work that I did with the archaeologists when we were doing the cultural resource survey for the center and the south and the north Chautauqua Lake Sewer District suggest, based on a village site above Fardink Road and another village site in the town of Ellery, which is buried under the construction of the Southern Tier Expressway, these village sites suggest an elevation of a lake maybe 20 feet higher than we know it today. My information of recent times, when we begin to talk about European man coming to Chautauqua Lake, suggests that the lake may have been shallower than it is today. And we'll go into that detail when we get to that period of history that we're going to be interested in discussing. It's a strange and challenging thing when you look at the lake and the soils maps, and I would suggest to all of you, I'm going to show you a document that becomes very important to anybody that is going to make any decisions about Chautauqua Lake, is that you get hold of this document, which I believe is in every library in the county, or it may be available at the Ag Center up at the airport. This document tells you what the top 3 feet of soil may be in an area in which you are going to work. It's accurate down to the about a 2.5 acre level of accuracy. It's extremely important. To give you an idea of why geology is important, in 1965-66, I had an opportunity to be away from Chautauqua County for a year. And while I was away, there was an announcement that there was going to be a large development taking place at the northern end of Chautauqua Lake, up in the Hartfield Bay area. Oh, as we look at this map, I don't know if the detail is good enough. This map is based on 1954 information, and it doesn't show the completion of what is now known as Sea Lion Drive over to the roads on each side of the big inlet. So we have some historic glitches that we're going to have to deal with. But there was an announcement that there were going to be a tremendous condominium development, and there were going to be channels dug into this area. And I happened to come home every month for 2 days at that time. And at the time, John Bertrand was the mayor, and I said, John, has anybody done any soil investigations? Have they done any boring information? Can they really build what they're proposing to build in the big inlet? Will the soils really support what you're talking about? And he said, no one's done any boring. And I said, well, I think that you've got to do that. And of course, it was borne out when we finally went to the construction of the North Chautauqua Lake sewer system in the 70s, that we have a thin layer of wonderful Shenango gravels around this end of the lake that are very well drained. But in their being well drained, they're only well drained maybe this much, 6 feet. And once you get down below that 6 feet, you go into organic silts. And when they held the testing tools up, all they had to do was hold them up. They didn't even have to pound them. And they just slowly but surely sank down and down and down. We never went as far down as we could go. I've already referred to you to the 130 some odd feet for a lens of sharp gravel. When they were doing the investigation for the construction of the bridge across Chautauqua Lake, they finally designed that bridge with friction pilings. Those pilings don't go down to bedrock. It was too expensive to go down to bedrock. What they have done is they've made the pilings big enough and boxed them in with enough concrete that the friction on the sides of them are what support the bridge. It's not down to bedrock. Some of them on each side are to bedrock, but as you get out into the center of the lake, we're dealing with an entirely different thing. So we're looking at a through valley that flowed north as the pre-runner, pre-glacial experience of this particular area. If we were to step over and go down to one of the hills in Jamestown, what used to be called the Roost, which is now owned by Jamestown Audubon Society, and we were to look up the Cassadaga Valley, we would find that the Cassadaga Valley from the Cassadaga Lakes is flowing southward, and as it meets the river from Warren area that is flowing northward, it turns and it flows northward and goes out at Cattaraugus Creek at the northeastern corner of the county, pre-glacial. The glaciers came along, they smushed, they moved, they changed elevation, and as they left an interesting challenge. I've suggested a view of 1,000,000 years ago. Let's take you back to the first retreat of the glacier, because we've got to understand the first retreat of the glacier to understand our estimates of siltation in the lake. When the glaciers first retreat, we've got bare land till exposed to the elements. And we have got to have experienced extremely high rates of erosion during that period of time. We've got to also have experienced filling in of hundreds of feet into the valley. High rates of erosion until we begin to get the plant transition which takes place in all instances if there's an appropriate climate. And finally, at some point in time, we reach a climax forest. The climax forest of the watershed was dominated by maple, hickory, oak, American chestnut, hemlock, white pine, and it depends upon what side of the hill you're on as to which of these plants might be part of the dominant community. The total area. I would like to take you out into a woodlot and have you walk through the experience of what the first European man might have seen, but we don't have a virgin forest in Chautauqua County. We have old forests in Chautauqua County, but not any virgin timber. But we're talking about trees, some of them, the pines, this big around, and we're talking about them going 200 feet in the air. All of them related to where they are located on the hillside and the type of soil that we're in. And if you want to understand the types of soil that we're dealing with some soils that have a depth of only 18 inches, and then you get to a hard pan that doesn't transmit water very easily. In other areas, we can have an all-day rain at maybe 2 inches of rain a day, and the Shenango gravels are well drained, and the water just travels down through them and becomes part of the groundwater. We'll get more into the mechanics of the water and the annual precipitation in a later presentation. But it's important to understand that the glaciers laid down a discipline for us that we ought to respect, and if we will respect it, we will avoid some problems. As an example, I have suggested that in the rural countryside in Chautauqua Lake watershed, if you're not building in a municipality that has a municipal water supply, whatever it might be, that people ought to build on a density of no less than an acre lot with a minimum dimension of the lot of 200 feet in order to keep wells far enough apart that you don't compete for the same groundwater supply. This is one of those things that you should understand that is our geological heritage in terms of what Chautauqua Lake and how it happened. The other thing that we're interested in is the potential. We've got to tell you that there are parts of the lake have shale bottoms, parts of the lake have muck bottoms, parts of the lake have what the divers told me in the 70s was suspended solids, and these suspended solids might be 3 or 4 feet thick. When we did a series of borings in the bottom of the lake, one of the things I asked the investigation team to do was, could we find the ash industry as a deposition in the sediments in the bottom of the lake? In other words, could we find that area when they were burning the majority of the trees and sending pearl ash out of Chautauqua County? And the answer came back that the benthic organisms are so active that they've churned that type of information up, and it's totally mixed. However, when they went to doing some sampling in the crook of the Long Point State Park, they literally lost the boring tool several times in this organic mass that's suspended down there, and they had a difficult time getting their boring tool back. The lake, I don't know that we're going to be able to do a good job today. With this illustration, I would hope to have a better illustration later. We have a lake that shows evidence of a long sloping plain here down to the deepest part off of Mission Meadows, which is 77 to 75 feet deep. And then we get a couple of more deep holes, and we come around to mid-lake, and then we go into the lower lake. The maximum depth of the lower lake is 20 feet. Then they throw some terms at us that are extremely interesting. They talk to us about Chautauqua Lake having an average depth of 35 feet, but a mean depth of 26 feet, which just boggles my mind because I have to adjust between average and mean. Then we have the lower lake, which has an average depth of 11 feet. John, what do those things mean? They are going to tell us something about our challenge as we deal with people that are frustrated with the weeds. I'm sorry, the aquatic vegetation that grows in Chautauqua Lake. All part of our geological history. The lake is a discipline. If we will respect the disciplines that the lake gives us, we can have an enjoyable time with the lake. If we do not respect those disciplines, we have a difficult time. And the best thing I can do is for those people that have been on the lake for an extended period of time, realize that in 1934 or 35, the Board of Supervisors authorized their first funding to do something about the dangerous algae conditions on the lake. If you remember the summer of '88 and '89, we had a weed growth in parts of the lake that just absolutely irritated a lot of people trying to use the lake. You couldn't leave shore in a sailboat and sail. You had to keep your centerboard out, and you had to get out beyond the weeds. Part of this is the result of the geological history. Part of it is our contribution. As an example, the construction of the Southern Tier Expressway. When the first parts of the Southern Tier Expressway were built in Chautauqua County, we were not very environmentally sensitive, to the point that the county executive actually got funds appropriated to re-dredge some areas of the lake because of the manner in which the construction took place. And we didn't discipline ourselves to stop the erosion. All of this in the final construction of the Southern Tier Expressway is now being considered. But we've got to look at and understand our geological history of how we came to where we are, and it is going to discipline us in the future. I would invite you to the rest of the sessions. Our next session will deal with Chautauqua Lake and its history from 14,000 to 12,000 before present, up to the year 1749 when Celeron came through the area. We look forward to the next session.